Wonderful. Fantastic. And Heinrich, if you pick up any problems, will you just unmute and you can stop me, or you guys can write, as I said. Welcome, Vicky. So this evening is a subject that I would have to say is probably the closest to my heart out of anything that I speak about. I would playfully tell you that the reason why I love talking about fear, working with fear, and doing workshops on fear is because I feel like I'm a fear expert. And you know why? Because I've been afraid most of my life. So that's all I mean by an expert. Fear has been a huge part of my life, and I'll touch on that slightly. So naturally, when I speak about it, it is so close to my heart. You know, my earliest memories that I have were actually memories of being absolutely terrified. Those are my earliest memories. I can remember where I was standing as a little child. I can remember lying, and I can remember the sweat, and I can remember smell, and I can remember what was going on inside me. And I actually have to go quite deep into my childhood to actually find safe memories. And it's a very interesting thing. And what's very interesting about my story, which we're not going to spend much time on, is that it did not have much to do with the environment that I grew up in, even though that was quite challenging. There are all sorts of labels in my desperation to understand what it was that was going on with me as a child that I picked up. I've been told that I have CPTSD, which means multiple traumas. I've been told I have a type of epilepsy, and go into psychosis. So regularly as a child, of course, my parents did not know what I was experiencing. I would slip completely out of reality, and I was having experiences that made no sense. I would see things that weren't necessarily there, however we want to perceive that. But I can't say it was romantic and it felt like gifts or anything like that. I was mostly just constantly in a state of anxiety, in a state of panic. And when I moved later on into my teens, as I said to you guys, I began to able to recognize that I was actually in full-blown psychosis. You know, it's a very, very difficult thing to ever be able to explain. And the only reason that I'm connecting to that early on is because I think we have all walked very, very individual paths with whatever fear might be. And I want to take a little journey with you over the next few minutes where we're just going to dive into the possibility of what fear actually might be. What I can tell you is there's nothing romantic about my story. And by the time I was in my early 20s, I had literally a psychotic break. And for about 4 or 5 months, I did not even leave my house. I was in one permanent panic attack for 5 months. I paced nonstop. I was nonsensical. I would pass out for a few minutes at a time and then stay awake for 2 or 3 days. It was just, to be honest with you guys, I was in an absolute state of hell. And at that stage, being early in my 20s, I remember very often the few times I could cry, because when you're in a high state of fear, you can't connect to the tears. The tears are always a sign that you're getting somewhere. And I remember just being so utterly shocked that this is what my life was going to turn out to be, that I was going to end up staying in an asylum for the rest of my life. And the reason I connect you with that is just because of where the journey and the things we're going to speak of were all born of within me. And each of you holds such a unique path for yourself. But when I tell you that there's no romanticism in the story, what I can tell you is that at some stage in my 20s, I remember in a blur of vodka, because later on I eventually became so desperate, I tried pretty much anything. I've even drunk, what's it called, mouthwash in my life. I have at different times been pushed to levels of desperation that I am not embarrassed about, that I'm quite willing to own. But I remember one night crawling on the floor in my room in a blur of vodka and tears and angst. And I was in such hell. Obviously, I'm not too concerned with what it was that I was actually experiencing, and I'll tell you why. But I actually looked into the darkness and I said to myself, if I ever find a way out of this, if I ever find a way out of this, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to find other people like me. And of course, when I said that at the time, I didn't believe for even a moment that there was any chance I ever would. And there was no magic pill. And what I can tell you is that all these years later, a reasonably functional member of society, and to this day, I am in a journey to heal the traumas within me and the fear that is trapped somatically within my being. And it has been a journey that has been so epic. Now, this, I'm sure, sounds like a very sad story, but it isn't. And just like your story, it is a story that comes with so many different aspects. I think that there's so many people that are sitting in this room right now. Some of us are aware of the traumas that we hold, and some of us are aware of the anxieties and the panics that we hold, and some of us are not even sure where it stems from. An amazing thing that I've noticed in working with so many people over the years is that if you're at the stage where you are aware that you're really battling with fear, that you're actually quite far in your initiation. And I will divulge on that later. Most people are not even aware of the fact that they are reacting, they are choosing, and that they are expressing out of fear. People think that they're simply irritable. People think that they just don't like certain kinds of intimacy. People think that they just don't like exciting things. There are all sorts of behavior modifications that we make in life, never really aware of the fact that it is because of old wounds. So whatever traumas you carry into this space, I want to just acknowledge it. And I want to acknowledge you for coming and bringing yourself to this conversation. I certainly do not have the answers of anything, but I do hope that you find one little key in the short journey for yourself that we are going to take. You know, an absolutely fascinating thing is another thing I've realized in this conversation of fear is we have many labels for mental illness. I had an absolute list of them and of supposed mental disorders. And the incredible thing is what I've realized more and more, and this is why I'm so passionate about this. Do you know how many people, once you can help their relationship with fear, you can help them quantify what's really going on? Do you know how many mental disorders begin to simply evaporate as though they were never there? And at the base of most forms of schisms within the psyche is a blueprint that sits in the back of your mind that began perhaps the first time your father hit you, or perhaps the first time someone simply said something heartbroken to you. It could have been anything. It could have been an accident. It could have been the first time as a child you tripped and hit your head. And if you look at what trauma is in its essence, I mean, there are many descriptions of trauma. But, you know, I was listening to a 6.5-hour book this week on audio when I went to bed. And this guy's description of trauma was simply an event that happens to you that in that moment, you are so overwhelmed that there's no way for you to process or get present with it. And it creates this blueprint within your mind. And the incredible thing is what I want to connect us with before we go on this journey is that blueprint for you might not make sense. You might not even know where it lies. The most incredible thing is what we're learning about epigenetics now, which means generational pain. We know that up to 7 generations before, we are actually passing traumas and pains onto each other. Now, that is an absolutely dynamic conversation because some of you are sitting in this room with levels of anxiety and pain and trauma that you have spent your whole life trying to find some sort of quantifying factor for. But in the journey that we are taking, it is not important where it comes from, just the acknowledgement of how it would store in your body and how it would create this blueprint. And I'm using this archetype of the blueprint because I want to give you an example of how this could work in your life. When you create a traumatic or you have a traumatic experience or a fearful experience, there's usually one word that would always be enmeshed, and that would be the word being helpless. And you almost make yourself a psychological and emotional promise, just like I did in my life, that I will never go there again. And this blueprint then sits in the back of your mind. So for one person in this room, it might have been a way they were really hurt as a child, emotionally. For another person like myself, it was panic attacks, slipping out of reality. It doesn't matter what it was. But then for the rest of my life and for the rest of your lives, unless we actually eventually do the shadow work, what happens is anytime you start to approach an event or a thing that would take you to that same similar place, we would do absolutely anything to avoid it. And most of us are not even aware of that. And I want to suggest something on this journey. I want to suggest that fear, in shame is an initiation. Do you know in shamanism, in certain sects of shamanism, there's the story, and you also hear it in Gnostic texts. You also find it in certain Eastern mythologies of the ultimate levels of initiations that a soul must take. And in the story, there are many levels. There's the piercing of the heart. And if you work counseling, or some of you are psychiatrists, psychologists, you know how very often certain dark nights of the soul are always triggered by certain things. At least 30% of people's life darkness can come from a broken heart, triggered by the piercing of the heart. But the one that we're talking about is in certain texts, the initiation of fear is the final level of initiation for a soul, where they will have to face fear itself head on. And why I think this is really powerful, if you're just going to, for the next while, entertain this idea with me, I want you to consider how many people, perhaps even in this room, are believing something about themselves and their spiritual journey that is not true. An example, perhaps one of you has anxiety attacks. Perhaps one of you feels really unsafe in the world right now. And you are trying to tie in how this can be a possibility as a person who reads and explores and does spiritual work. And how is it possible that this fear is so present in my life? And I want to suggest something, and that suggestion is that this is the ultimate initiation. And pretty much all that's going on in the world, if you look at it over a spectrum of hundreds of years, I'm going to make a very generic statement, is everybody is pretty much just passing the parcel. That's how it is. I have a certain amount of pain, whether it comes from generations or personal experience, and whether it's genetic or whether it's psychological or karmic, whatever you wish to, it's usually probably all of them. And when I can't handle my pain, I spill it out onto someone else. The abuse cycle becomes the next cycle of abuse. The whole world is passing parcels. And we are the generation that has been asked to stand. A lot of people think that the world is lost right now because we are enmeshed in fear. We are enmeshed in the ultimate world global initiation. So what I mean by this is, you have been called to stand in the enormity of the emotional precedence of your family line. You might be the first person in the history of your family that is not going to repeat a cycle of no intimacy, a cycle of no connection, a cycle of abuse, perhaps a cycle of addiction. And we really like to believe that we have nothing to do with our far removed uncles and aunts. Something very similar to what I have in my life. So it's an incredible thing. And I just want you, as we go down this path, I want you to just sitting where you are now, just to consider that you don't think your life has an enormous meaning. You might not even have children. I want you to consider that even science can prove that is what is running through your veins now connects not just biologically for many generations, but you are part of a soul family. And we are in 2021, and has been prophesied across the board in every single school of thought that now is the time. So if your life is in chaos, I want you to consider the fact that you might be doing something right. And I want us to connect to that. And if we were to consider that fear could be one of the ultimate levels of initiation, you only take on board what works for you. I know no more than you do. pick up what you need. But I want to consider something. What is the path of fear? It is the path of ultimate love. How safe do you think love will ever be in this world if we are not able to stand in the absolute enormous dark pressure of fear? Think about it in a practical sense, because I'm being very heavy at the moment. Think about it in a practical sense. Fear, when it is not held, when it is not able to be, when you're not able to hold space for it, love becomes a weapon. Think about it in relationships. Think about it in relationships between a mother and a child, or between a husband and a wife. Love becomes a weapon. And can you imagine that what we are trying to do, and now this is obviously not something that you need to align with, we are trying to bring in a level of love that has never been held on this planet. And we have to be able to face the polar opposite contrast of that, which means walking into that dark cave. And someone who is able to stand unwielding in the shaking power of fear can be given the ultimate level and quota of love, because it will be safe with them. Those people will not poison their communities. They will not poison their families. And you have to ask yourself whether love is safe with you. So it's an incredible thing to realize that perhaps in this anxiety, or in this trauma that you can't heal, or a restlessness perhaps, that you might be on the initiation of love. You know, fear has many, many faces. So I want to give you a little bit of an insight here of where we're going. You know, I had an extreme fear of spiders. An incredible thing, naturally, I was going to therapy in my 20s. And at that stage, I didn't really understand what I understood now. So when I was always afraid, all I could think to do was think of things I was afraid of and try and sort those things out. I became so complex at one stage in my psychosis that I had a very rare disorder where I was afraid to close my eyes. So let's take the spider now. Let's say you spend 6 months on a psychologist's couch, and eventually you dealt with this impending fear of spiders. And eventually you can hold that spider in the palm of your hand. And even though you are so uncomfortable, you're able to embrace it. So the question that really came across my mind was, have I actually accomplished anything? Because what I soon noticed is I walk out the door, and lo and behold, there is a new fear that has found me. And this happened over and over. And perhaps my version was a bit extreme, but I see it in people's lives. And I began to realize that fear is all smoke and mirrors. If you sit down and talk to people, very few of them can talk about fear itself as a quantifying archetype. They will be able to list all sorts of things that they are afraid of. And to me, there is only one wolf, and that is fear itself. And what's amazing is people think, well, I'm afraid of airplanes, and I'm afraid of intimacy, and I'm afraid of my own chaos, or whatever it be. And we constantly try to heal those things, never realizing that a single wolf has a smoke machine and 1,000 mirrors. And if we keep thinking about what it is we're afraid of, we get nowhere. The question that we have to ask ourselves is fear itself. And you know, many poets and many philosophers touched on this, but it is fear itself that we are avoiding. I want to suggest, when we suggested this blueprint in our minds of that thing that we will always avoid, that helplessness that we've touched on, that you once felt, and now your entire psychology will make sure that you never go to that vulnerability. So if this is possible, that there is actually only one thing that everybody is afraid of, and it is only fear. I don't want you to be convinced just yet. I want to have a conversation regarding it. So for us to discover if this is true, we would have to build, first of all, an archetype. Because one of the hardest things about fear, why this incredible teacher, now that sounds very strange, I'm sure. Fear is my number one teacher, my guru. I have learned more from this consciousness than I have from anything else in my life. And she has very specific lessons to teach. Now, if it is true that there is only one fear, we'd have to dive into that. So let's look at the archetype first. The problem with fear is it's intangible, as I was saying, which means that it plays smoke and mirrors and we're never really sure what's going on. What does fear actually look like? Let's try and make it tangible. Let's pull it out of the air and actually give it an expression. So the first thing I can think of is, well, what happens to you when you're afraid? And I'm just going to rattle off a few different things so that you can start getting a feel for this energy. Your heart can start to beat a little bit faster. Your sweat glands can begin to go. You can begin to feel really agitated or uncomfortable. Your bladder can begin to contract and you might need the toilet more. You might find that your breathing starts to change even to the point of absolute panic. You might find, because once adrenaline starts flowing through your body, that the adrenal systems cause you to even go into a feeling of unreality. Many people that have panic attacks report having periods where they're not even sure if the wall is real, and almost as though reality is collapsing on them. And all the types of things that happen to your solar plexus. Now, we will speak of this a little bit in the second half that we're moving into shortly. But in your solar plexus, essentially, is this disk of energy, whether you want to use a spiritual archetype of the solar sun that spins at your disk, that once penetrated is your fear center. And if you want to look at it from the perspective of the fact that we have now realized more and more that all along they were right when they said that you know in your stomach. So what I want us to connect to is that there is something that happens within our solar plexus that is so emotionally invoking that it literally drives us up and down the streets of our lives as though we think we have free will. So I'm connecting to the angst and the dread that can go in your solar plexus, the sweating, the breathing, the unreality, the disconnect. So we're giving fear this tangibility. And only people that through some process with a good therapist or with a shamanic guide or shadow work, only people that are absolutely able to realize, there is one wolf and that wolf has many faces, or they are able to move to what I would call almost an eye of a needle. And what I mean by that is, do you want to spend the rest of your life trying to sort out and become courageous on different platforms? And you know how we do it? We do it via information. We try and make the comic tragedies of life okay through mental concepts, which is why we are becoming more and more possessed by our frontal lobes. And what I mean by that is, if you were to feel better about death, well, what happens is you come up with a mental concept. And if you feel better about spirituality, you come up with a mental concept. And a person who begins to realize that what actually happens is that when that wolf moves in and begins to invoke itself fully in your presence. Now, I'm not trying to scare you. I'm using an archetype. And you know, most people that really battle with fear even find difficulty having this conversation. And when this wolf pulls in, what immediately happens is your blueprint and archetype in the back of your mind of just how far this can go. I will not allow myself to go this place again, whether it is being uncomfortable in intimacy, whether it is someone's going to hurt you, no matter what it is, we cannot allow ourselves to go to that helpless place. And the incredible thing is we spend our entire life suppressing this feeling. And most people will tell you, you know, if you take a textbook, if you read some psychology, one of the things it says in a textbook about psychology, about panic attacks, is it is one of the most uncomfortable psychological states a human being can experience without permanent damage. So this is an absolutely enormous thing that happens to us. Fear itself. and we've made fear tangible. What would the power of making this thing so tangible be? What would the importance of it? Well, we spoke about the fact that there's a potential that actually, without us realizing it, when a certain level of fear rises and all those areas begin to activate emotionally, psychically, mentally, fear is now starting to evoke itself. We will do anything to avoid it. We all hold a secret belief. Most people I've ever spoken to hold a secret belief, and they actually don't know until they do shadow work. They don't even know it's there. They believe that if it ever got too big or too strong, that something terrible would happen. Even beyond death sometimes is the belief. So if you've ever had a really, really powerful fear moment, perhaps you were sitting in a car and had a panic attack, perhaps you literally thought, like I've had an asthma attack surfing where I thought I was going to die, you will know that that fear moves fully in. The power of being able to make this wolf tangible, we'll have a look into shortly. The other thing that would have to be brought to this conversation would be, now that we've spoken about the physical aspects, would have to be the relationship that the mind has with fear. Now, it's a very, very strange thing to think about, but for the most part, right, because there is a very primal area of your brain that almost instantly reacts to certain things. Like, for instance, I know it's a very funny story, but you know, they've done studies where sometimes when graders and earth moving equipment is building in your area, your anxiety might be quite high because your brain attests that to wild animals roaring in the area. So there are a lot of unconscious mechanisms that take place within your body for fear. But largely, a massive part of fear is only invoked and only exists in the realm of thought. I just want to pause that for a second. Just for a second, think about that. So if you were to attest or to speak to people when they say things like suffering, do you know when people deeply, deeply suffer, do you know how few times they are speaking about pain? Suffering and pain are not the same thing. For instance, I think it was Walt Whitman, the great writer, who spoke about how a bird could sit on a branch and slowly freeze to death and fall to the earth dead without ever feeling sorry for itself. And the comment of the discussion is that the bird feels pain but does not suffer. Now, naturally, this is a semantical argument, but why I'm connecting you to this is it is the psychological hell and torment that we create within our mind where fear dances and is born. And once you lose control of that gate, then fear can fully emanate within your being. And if you are not at the point where you are aware of the fear archetype, you know the great secret, which is that fear can go nowhere. She will howl as loudly as she can, and if you simply sit with it, it will dissipate. But if you begin to push her down and try and get her away and avoid her, you become the person walking through the forest on the cold snow during a night with a wolf that's slowly stalking you. And when you realize that that wolf is stalking you and you begin to run, the wolf begins to get a lot of confidence. And if you have been avoiding something for a long time, whether it is an addiction or a deep-seated fear, some of you know that eventually the wolf calls its friends, and eventually they are all chasing you through the forest. And the joke is, and I mean joke very sarcastically, is that you can only run for so long. And this is where a lot of psychological disorders, it's very hard as a therapist or to find those things in the background that sometimes have been pushed so far back that the person is not even aware of what the original helplessness was. But the secret here would be the fact that in the shamanistic ritual, that if you turn and you run at fear, if she's after you and you turn in that forest and you run right back at her snarling, ah, is this the best you've got? And what would this be like in your life? Often that would be done in a ceremony or in a session or with a healer, where for the first time you would actually not run from it. You would simply sit in it and allow it to fully express, allow the wolf to begin to howl within your whole presence. And you know what happens every time when you run at the wolf? She starts to turn away and she dissipates. And that is an ancient shamanistic secret that's not such a secret. Many, many healers know this, that in the avoidance of the full emanating wolf. So why I'm discussing the mind, and why I'm talking about time. Time can only exist in thought. And this is not, I'm not trying to get too conceptual on you. I want to, for instance, let me give you an example. So let me try and anchor it into your own personal experience. They did quite a few things at Columbus University many years ago, and I managed to get hold of hundreds of these PDFs that I read through. And people were asked questions about their fears. Now, one study was about a fear that came up a lot of people dying on aeroplanes. Now, what was absolutely incredible about this is most people that tested, and this gives us an awareness of just how the lack of awareness is there. Most people that tested that they were sure that they were scared of dying in the aeroplane. It was death via aeroplane that they were afraid of. I think that's pretty clear. But then they gave them a second set of questions in a room on your own. And the questions were about what it is about dying in an aeroplane that people were afraid of. And what they discovered was it was being trapped in an aeroplane. It was the fact that they had this idea that in an aeroplane, in this tube falling out of the sky towards their death, that they envisaged that the fear wolf would be at its full quantifiable enormity. Do you know what I mean? It's a type of, their imagination is telling them, well, they can't be much worse than that. So then the set of questions led them, but then essentially what you're saying is you are already afraid to be falling in an aeroplane towards your death. So I'm going to jump ahead with all these questions. There were hundreds of them. And what they eventually ascertained is that when people are extremely afraid of something, they are actually afraid of the level of fear that they think they're going to feel. Because once you've hit that ground, it's over. And they did this experiment over and over and over on many, many things, even with spiders, where people that have absolutely terrifying thoughts about spiders, what did they do? They take the spider and eventually they make the person realize that the person is actually not afraid of the spider. The person happens to have that spider as a doorway to their life, a smoke and mirror that sometime penetrated into their consciousness, that it has an input to you now, that when you see a spider, that wolf comes in and fully invokes. So if that's confusing, in other words, we all have a trigger, and certain triggers have worn us down and we have built narratives around them. And one person will sit and stare at a big hairy spider and smile at it, and another person will be convinced they are afraid of the spider. But what they are afraid of, and here is the key, they are afraid of the way the spider makes them feel. That's the absolute key there. And if you're beginning to understand how powerful this conversation can be to have in your own life, is to begin to realize that if you are, as the great poem said, it is only fear that you need to fear. When you have that realization, you will stop spending all your conscious energy on trying to solve all these different things. You will simply prepare yourself for that initiation, which was held in many cultures over thousands of years. There was the initiation of facing. For instance, look in shamanism. You know, if you look at it, certain psychology, certain ideas from Jung and Freud, and there's this idea that a lot of our fears come from our fear of mortality, the fact that we're going to die. And if you look at shamanism, they had this idea that it was fear itself that had to be faced. And they agreed with psychology that one of the ultimate fears was death itself because it was so unquantifiable. And then look what the ultimate ceremony in shamanism is. It's to face your own death. Whether you jump in one spot for days, whether you drink some sort of a potion that removes a certain area of your brain, makes it go quiet so you experience yourself differently. Essentially, the shamanistic culture held that space for you to move towards that eye of the needle. Some of you have done it in trance, in breath work, and to have everything ripped asunder off you as you go through that eye of the needle in absolute terror, and to boom, pop through on the other side in absolute peace. So shamanism essentially has always held the space of allowing you to die long before you die so that you may live. And there are many writers who have written about this. This is not my words. And this is another testament to what we're saying, that it is only fear itself. So when we realize how the monkey mind gets involved, we could be a little bit more playful. I mean, have you ever had someone say something to you like, hey, bro, next time I see you, we need to talk? I mean, that's cruel. To me, that's cruel. Because I'll be fine until I climb into bed. And then my mind will start and be like, I don't know what they need to talk about. Now, what we need to identify here is the relationship between what's going on in here and our solar plexus. And once our solar plexus are penetrated, it's all downhill from there. So you lie now, you're obsessing and you think, wow, you know, about 9 years ago when we were still in school, I stole something from this guy and I think he knows now. And you lie there and anxiety starts to crease in your solar plexus. About 2 o'clock in the morning, you can't sleep. And now you've already worked out your defense. Now you've already worked out what he's going to say. And now you've already worked out what you're going to say. And you're having this imaginary fight in your mind. And of course, your body is emotionally responding to all these thoughts. And by the time you see him the next day, he's like, oh, I just wanted to tell you, thanks for bringing the pie the other day. So that is a very, very simplistic version of how the mind plays with us. It's an absolutely incredible thing. In the Buddhist temples in Thailand, actually in many places, there is this idea of the monkeys all over the roof, ripping the temple apart, and the ideas of the monkey mind, that once you let that monkey off the leash, that monkey is going to wreck the temple of your being. And tell me that you do not know people that are possessed by their minds. The mind is meant to be a very, very powerful tool. But once you take that mind very seriously and you are convinced that the voice in your head is you are at the mercy of this wolf. And it's a very important conversation, because essentially the conversation at hand is we are trying to look at the deeper occult and metaphysical side to fear. And if you cannot identify that this fear tends to 9 out of 10 times penetrate through an idea or a thought. And what's incredible is when you begin to realize, like if you look at the idea in shadow work or in like the Russian term, the Russian idea in some of the philosophies where they spoke about the doppelgangers, what's really interesting is it is your own darker half. It is your own other quantifiable energy that you have to face and transmute. And why I bring that up is it's like saying that you are actually at war with yourself and you know all your own weaknesses. So what is difficult for you is very difficult to what's different to what's difficult to me. And your mind knows that. And when your mind is in charge and it's trying to dominate your life, I'll give you an example. Maybe you have a fear of something. Maybe you have a fear of being sick or dying or whatever it is. And then you tell me you haven't had this experience. And then maybe you feel a little bit sweaty and maybe you feel a bit sick and you eat something, you're a bit nauseous and you're feeling totally fine. Your fear is under control. And suddenly you're in the shower and your mind goes, hey, you might be dying. And just because there's a little bit of evidence to back this up, the thought that you would usually very powerfully push away, this thought penetrates through the gate And now you've taken this thought and and suddenly it's inside and it goes. And next thing, you're in this absolute spin about the fact that you might be dying. So it's a very animated conversation, but I just want us to identify that if we are to go on the journey of understanding the role of fear within ourselves and in the people that we work with, we need to understand that the conversation of the mind has to take place. It is absolutely pivotal and key. And it is obviously a conversation that you could have, wow, for a very long time. But I feel like a lot of these people in this room are very well read and have your own perceptions and ideas about this. But if you really do battle with anxiety, and if you really do battle with panic, and I don't ever get to speak to you about that, I want you to really begin to identify how it all starts with one thing. You are the guardian at the gate of your own mind. That is what the path of initiation is about. And your mind will make many suggestions. And many of those suggestions are very helpful. Don't run into the wall. Eat some food. It is your 3D interface. But your mind will also make certain shadow suggestions to you. And those thoughts are so unique to you. But let's say, for instance, it could be in a relationship, your mind keeps telling you this person doesn't really care about me. It's always going to be based on your wound. And that mind is always going to try and find a way through. And it's through thought forms, through ideas, through some story you've heard. And once it's penetrated well, then often for many of us, it's all downhill from there. So continuing with this conversation, I think the very important thing for us to identify, and I'm not going to spend much time on it, is we essentially have three brains. This is not even that controversial anymore. You have three brains, and you are the guardian of the gate of all three. And if you are penetrated through one of those gates, all three fall out of alignment. This is the ultimate level of mastery. And I'm not talking about mastery as a perfect being. I mean, for instance, what are your three brains? Well, you have this brain in your head. You have your emotional intelligence, which, as they know, has an entire field. We all know that emotions are one of the most incredible ways to perceive the world. And then you have your solar plexus, where 80% of all, I can't think of the chemical's name now, serotonin is born. They used to think it came from your brain. They used to tell you that you had a problem with your brain doesn't make serotonin. Meanwhile, your stomach is making your serotonin. And when you feel sick and when you feel something is really wrong, you feel it in your solar plexus. And you have all three of these regions, your thought region and your maturity that you have with it, your emotional region and the maturity that you have with it, and then your power region, which is your solar plexus. And most people, including myself, we are out of our seat of power much of our lives simply because of the fact that we hold this blueprint and this wound that we fear to enter. It is a cave that we do not want to walk towards. And the more we avoid it, the more the wolves build, the more they call friends, the more we begin to create strange addictions, psychological disorders, avoidance systems. And it's an incredible thing when you think about those three levels of those three minds, those three brains that you have, those three levels of intelligence. For instance, mine was a lot of psychological trauma. You might have emotional trauma. And wherever that wound is, it can create a hole. So what is this wolf story? What is this archetype all about? Well, how this would work is I've worked with so many people that have panic attacks that they try everything. They calming mechanisms and the elastic band and every book you can imagine, and they're taking pills. But essentially what is going on there is that person loses a large portion of their lives because they will never want to be in traffic and they'll never want to do certain things. And all that really happens with someone once they've had a terrifying experience that completely rocks them into trauma is you spend the rest of your life at different levels of micromanaging it. So what you can do, and it's a very difficult path, the shamanistic way, would be to get to the point where you feel psychologically strong enough where you're going to call the wolf out. And an example would be, you could be sitting in a car one day and this thing starts rising and you've done the prep and you understand the archetype and you are totally aware that something or no, it feels so terrible is a tangible thing. The wolf is coming and you begin to sweat and you're feeling panicky. You know what the break point is where you take your life back? Is that you hold on to the steering wheel. I remember the very moment I did it, and it was a different environment, and it's your first victory you'll never forget, is in desperation, because I had run for so long that I was so tired that I didn't know if I would be able to literally cope with any stress anymore, is I growled to myself in this primal space, is that the fucking best you've got? That's what was going on inside me. I was so tired and so fed up, and so I had lost 10 years of my life to these seizures and these panic attacks, and I was literally at the point that the last thing, just like when you experience a death in ceremony or a birth, I was at that point where I was like, take me, just take me. And I had been hanging on for 10 years trying to keep this thing down, because I believed that if it ever got any stronger, I would psychologically snap and never come back. And I invoked this thing, and I, like a madman, I screamed, is that the best you've got? And guess what happened? Usually I would sit in the seizure for up to 3 days. The doctors didn't even believe me. They used to put me on these freaking things and watch to see if I was telling the truth. And what I can tell you is the first time I called this wolf out, within 3 minutes, I was in absolute silence, lying on my back in the grass, because I was in the garden in the middle of the night. And I felt the first peace that I felt in 10 years. And this was the beginning of this path of meeting her. And that was the first night I saw her and what she would teach me. And you don't need to ascribe to the story, but what I can tell you is that many people I had the honor in my life of walking to the point where they're ready to actually call out the worst version of fear that they would ever feel. In other words, they are invoking the ultimate state of helplessness, and instead of running or fixing, they stand there in that space. And once you feel the wolf howling at full strength within you, and it dissipates, you take back the seat of your power. You move back into the castle of your solar plexus. And suddenly your whole life is not about this avoidance, because you have faced the worst version of it. And that is why the story of the wolf is so important. It is so absolutely important. Now, obviously, we're having a really short conversation here, and I'm really jumping across this very quickly. I want you to just consider. And it would be completely different for everyone. Essentially, what we do in the coaching that Heinrich and myself does, and in a lot of people, even people in this room, I know some of you work with this stuff. What you're essentially doing is you are facilitating a space where a few things are going to happen. The first thing is for someone to learn to hold space for the enormity of their emotions. So especially for the therapists and the people that really work in counseling, I want to give you a key here of what fear taught me. Most of what happens when we are having an emotional disorder is because we feel something about what we're feeling. So I want to try and break that down for you. If you have anxiety attacks, or you feel scared all the time, or if you're always angry, and you've been angry for so long that it's just getting so much, you don't know what to do with yourself. If you stop for a second and you hold space for it, you know what you'll realize? That the suffering comes from the way you feel about the fact that you're angry. The suffering comes from the fact that you can't handle the fact that you feel afraid. So you not only feel anxious, you not only feel panicky, but you're also having emotions towards the emotion. It's like a short circuit that is a one-way ticket to psychological issues. So one of the things you're doing in shadow work is you're getting yourself to the point where you are willing to allow yourself to let that emotion fully express. If you are anger, fear, it doesn't matter what it is. And the joke is, people say often in session, they say, but are you actually suggesting I invite this thing into my life? I'm like, yes, absolutely. Let it speak. And you know why? Do you want to know what the mother of all problems is? Is, for example, avoiding fear. Now we've got this blueprint in the back of our minds. We felt helpless, some of us for many experiences, maybe multiple panic attacks, maybe multiple physical abuses, maybe multiple bad relationships. And I want you to just consider for a second what happens to emotion when it rises and you push it down. It gets stronger and stronger, and eventually it becomes like the boiling pot. And it's an incredible thing. And you know that most of us are dealing with generational pain on top of the fact that we have not been given the tools to hold space for our emotions. We have this toxic love and light culture idea that we're supposed to be in a deep, meditative, happy state, bouncing around with daisies in our heads. And we have demonized the feelings of fear and helplessness and vulnerability to the point where we suppress them so much that they are dominating the psychology of the entire planet. This is why shadow work is coming into the fold. You know, eventually it won't be called shadow work. It'll just be called, well, work. It's normal. So I want you to just consider that, for instance, if you don't want to allow yourself to feel afraid, you will be afraid your whole life. If you are really scared of certain things, they're going to show up over and over. The wolf will use the mirror and smoke over and over. So suppression, or the avoidance of a feeling, means that you are giving your whole life to that feeling. If you are ultimately afraid of being alone, you will always feel alone. It's the most ridiculous thing when you begin to understand it. You know, there's a very famous poem, I'm not sure if it was by Rumi, but literally about if you need to spend some time alone so that you don't end up alone. And it's very cryptic, but it really isn't that cryptic. So in coaching, because we're approaching the end of a very intense conversation, in coaching, what you're essentially doing is you are trying to teach that person about a state of allowance. You know, you can solve and you can go and try and get all technical about where the pain comes from. And essentially, there are a few thoughts in the background there, and you will not allow yourself to go into that absolute helplessness. And there are certain feelings that you have built a narrative around. And when that feeling rises, you get feelings towards the feeling, which creates a sort of interference pattern that we experience as excessive thinking. That's the interference pattern of two emotions that are bumping against each other like that. So to get to the point where you start to hold space. Now, we spoke about the fact that we don't have the tools to do this. So in practicality, I want to let you know how this shows up in your life. You could come home from work, or maybe have an incredible day with a lover or a dog that you took to the beach. It doesn't matter. Climb onto your bed and everything seems fine. And as soon as your system starts to down tool, what suddenly happens? Boom, the stuff comes flying into your face. Suddenly you're in a high state of anxiety. You can't sleep. You start having obsessive thoughts at night, because when you try and step down, do you know what happens? You are filing so many emotions away and so many experiences away. We do not somatically allow it to rise. We do not allow it to express. And as soon as you begin to try and relax, this thing comes out. And it's a very powerful process. It's a process that naturally I'm very passionate about holding in coaching when we do shadow work, is finding what your original blueprint was, what your ultimate fear is. And it's not in the avoidance of that thing. We go directly at it. I'll give you a personal example of how I worked my own process on myself recently. And I'm very grateful for this. I have I have asthma, okay? And this asthma can be really strange. I've ended up, it's like, it doesn't give me a lot of hassles, but 3 times in the last 2 years, I've ended up in the emergency room with asthma. And what's really interesting is now with this whole COVID thing and with the fact that I stopped breathing while surfing and all this nonsense, I developed this fear of suffocating, which I think is like, I can see how I got there. I built a narrative around it, and suddenly I had this fear, even being someone who guides people through the process, my fear of suffocating. Do you know what happened to me for months? Is I would go to bed at night, and as soon as I thought about, like, because sometimes I breathe really badly, and then I would be like, oh, and I would think about suffocating, and I would completely avoid it. Oh, no, I'll go shower, I'll use some water vapor, I mustn't think about that, I'm not going to suffocate. And I realized after a few weeks, Nathan, you're doing exactly what you teach people not to do. So guess what I did? I lay on my bed one day, so tired of this little fear that was growing, because I was starting to run from this wolf. He was starting to chase me. And I eventually actually realized, okay, I've got to go into this. And I did a shadow work process on myself, which we do in the courses. And so what I did was I lay on my back, and I know this sounds really intense, but I've got to face it. And I held my breath. I thought, that's a terrible feeling. And I held my breath and I held my breath, and I started to feel a bit strange. And then I realized, you know what, 10, 15 seconds later, it would have been over. So instead of trying to sugarcoat this for myself, I literally took myself into what I call the worst case process. You look at the worst case scenario. Now, it doesn't mean that you want it to happen, but you know how I freed myself. I eventually realized, you know what, this is going to be really uncomfortable for about 90 seconds. Not nice. I'll probably be quite panicked. My heart will be pounding, and then it's over. So then I asked myself the question, if that had to happen, could you deal with it? Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is, fuck, I don't want to, but I could deal with it. And guess what's happened? I've got no fear of suffocating, because I don't want to suffocate. But if I stop breathing, I stop breathing. I'm prepared for it. I know it's going to be really uncomfortable for a short while, and then it's going to be over. Now, that is an example of how we have things like that right across the board in your life. Imagine, for instance, once I've taught you this process, naturally I can't do it now, but I think a lot of you will just be able to run with this without even having my help. But you imagine you climb into bed at night and you've got work the next day, and there's this huge meeting and you can't sleep. Maybe it's a week away. You know, I don't know if you guys know, I used to be a professional fighter, and one of the things fighters used to say in the change room, that fight will never be as bad as the week before. There's no fight you will ever fight that is as bad as the week before. Your mind absolutely rips you to pieces. So why I'm bringing that up is now you're lying in bed. Do you know how you free yourself from anxiety? Instead of sitting there trying to convince yourself that nothing's going to go wrong, ask yourself, well, what's my ultimate fear here? Well, you know what? You might not get the job, or you know what, even worse, you could lose your job. Now, that's a terrible thought. Then you ask yourself, if I lost my job, could I find a way to be okay? Would I survive? And then you'll find all these emotions coming up, and you're like, you know what? I really don't want this to happen, but I'll actually be okay if I lost my job. And guess what happens? Once you face the worst version of it, the smoke and mirrors are not working anymore, and the wolf goes to sleep, and so do you. And this is a process that we can do on a very surface level or right through life. So yeah, that's where it leaves us. And where I am in my life now is that sometimes I run from the wolf, but very soon I learn to turn around and run back at it. And sometimes I even run with the wolf pack now, as you can become the alpha of your own emotional spectrum. So I wanted to share some thoughts and ideas with you guys. And the idea, I suppose, that I hoped was that you could just perhaps identify certain things in your own life during this conversation, and where the seat of power lies, and how your solar plexus relates to it, and how your mind relates to the whole thing. Do you know, if you look at like for instance, the initiation training in the old Gnostic and the old Hermetic traditions, one of the things you'd have to do is you'd have to learn about your mind and how to become a guardian at the gate. And then you'd have to learn how to become a guardian of your heart. And it just makes so much sense. And if it can just inspire you, that if you, for instance, are reading a book by Eckhart Tolle, that doesn't have to sort everything out. That doesn't have to be your entire understanding of the universe, but understand, oh, I'm working on my mind now. I am making this gate less penetrable. And then if you do a process to do with the heart, or you go to some workshop where you learn to be vulnerable and you learn to love and share, and you are then working on the intelligence of the heart. And when you work on your primal intelligence, learning to sing and drum and find you screaming into the night or shouting out on the beach with your arms up, that primal intelligence is where you take that seat of power back. The first time you call that wolf out and she comes and your knees are buckling and you're sweating and you literally are convinced while your friend's talking to you that you're going to die during the conversation, and the wolf starts to dissipate and you realize you've won your first initiation. Life changes. It is never the same again. And I do believe, because we've come to the end of what I wanted to speak about, I do believe, because I'm experiencing it in my own life and I have seen it in many people, that the more I face this level of fear that I have lived in, the more this deeper kind of unconditional love is moving into my life. And I see it and I feel it and it permeates